Hello everyone. Today we've got a fun action comedy movie recap for you, starring the famous wrestler turned actor John Cena. Get ready for lots of laughs, excitement, actions, and some surprising moments. The movie begins with former Special Forces Mason Pettits saying how joining the army was the thing he was meant to do with his life, as we see his point of view of joining as a private. Mason always had an urge to stand up to others for the weak, and initially decided and successfully became a lawyer. However, after realizing that family life and settling down was not what he wanted out of life, Mason enlisted in the army, and after a while, he successfully became Special Forces. And for the first time in his life, Mason felt happy. On one mission, Mason and his Special Forces team were tasked with taking out a dictator named Venegas. Mason was first to rappel down when suddenly the chopper was hit by a rocket, throwing Mason to the ground and then crashing. Mason suffered a terrible back injury from the fall and was discharged from the army, which really affected him, as he felt like a failure and without purpose. He looks over his old army photos before hearing his wife Jenny calling for him to take their daughter Casey to school. Mason gets ready and greets his family before heading out with Casey. On the way, Casey tells him about a boy that always tries to kiss her, so Mason tells her to commit first-degree assault and chop him in the throat. He lets Casey off and heads to his office where he meets with a man who wants to hire him to fight his phone company on bogus charges. Mason is annoyed by the trivial nature of his role now, but accepts the task anyways and puts on a smile. Once the man leaves, Mason gets depressed once more, when at that moment his old Special Forces buddy Sebastian comes by to visit him. Sebastian reminds Mason how he said he would never become a lawyer, but Mason tells him he has a wife and child now, so he has to work. Sebastian wants to show Mason something, and he takes Mason to a hangar filled with military gear and personnel, all working for Sebastian. They head to his office where Mason thinks the CDI logo means Chicks Dig It, but Sebastian corrects him as it means Contracted Defense Initiatives. His company has every high-tech military equipment available. Mason is impressed hearing this, knowing when Sebastian had the idea for the company. Mason thinks that private security work borderlines on mercenary work, which he hates. But Sebastian tells him they only sell one product, security, and hints that he wants Mason to join his team. Mason refuses, complaining that he is too old. He then shows Mason a video of dictator Venegas, who is still ruling the South American country of Paldonia. Mason remembers his history with Venegas and does not want to work for him, but Sebastian tells him that he will be protecting a journalist who will be interviewing him. Mason makes it clear that he hates Venegas with a passion as he lost brothers to him, and Sebastian understands, as he was present, but he is now running a business, and Mason should focus on that. Mason refuses, but when he hears 20 grand, he was ready yesterday. The journalist to be protected is Claire Wellington, and we see her receive an award for her work. Mason is watching the video, trying to learn what kind of person she really is. The next day, Mason arrives late to pick up Casey and Jenny, and later learns that Casey did actually commit first-degree assault on the boy, whose father turns out to be a lawyer. Jenny gets fed up and overreacts, telling Mason she thinks he should move out for a while, and seeing that she's serious, he agrees. He goes to Casey's room to sit and talk with her, telling her that he has to go out of town for a few days for work. Jenny hears the news and again gets upset that he is going out of town. He tells her about the job he took, but Jenny thinks that he will go get himself killed. She knows he is disappointed with just being home and thinks that Mason settled for her. She then changes her mind again, telling him to go and maybe it will make him feel like a man again. Mason leaves without saying another word and shows up at Claire's apartment to pick her up. He runs to meet her, but she gives him her autograph thinking he is just a fan. He formally introduces himself, but Claire is rude and tells him to bring her luggage. On the way, she asks about his service in the army as a way to size Mason up. Mason tries telling her that Venegas is a bad person, but Claire tells him to focus on protecting her, while she focuses on what she does best. On the flight to Paldonia, Mason catches up on his research into Claire, where she would normally interview pop stars and artistes. She comes over to talk. He wonders why she chose to now interview a dictator, which is different from her norm. She tells him how private Venegas is, and was lucky to land an interview of a lifetime, and tells him to shut up with the questions. The two land in Paldonia, where they are greeted by the charismatic Venegas and his guards. Venegas greets Claire warmly, admiring her beauty and making her uncomfortable. Mason, on the other hand, gets his bags taken away and his pocket knife and firearm confiscated. They get into Venegas's car where Mason sits in the back, and Venegas indicates to Mason that he knows about him. They move out in a convoy where Venegas is excited about the upcoming interview. They get to a large gathering of people where Venegas brags about the love the people have for him. But a little girl flips him off, much to the pleasure of Mason. Venegas then pours him and Claire a drink, leaving Mason to wet his lips in jealousy. They get to a bridge when suddenly the lead car is blown up. Mason's brain takes vacation as they come under attack from militants who shoot and kill their driver. Mason logs back in and jumps into the front seat and is barely able to escape an RPG being fired at the car. RPG guy goes to reload, but Mason runs him over before he can. More militants turn up from both sides, and Mason reverses into one car before driving head-on into the other, killing the attackers. Mason takes back his gun and manages to kill 2 more men, but hurts his back in the process. He kills another man, and Venegas comes over thanking him and offering a massage. Mason thinks he and Claire should get someplace safe and call for help, but Venegas wants to head to the capital and stop the overthrow of his government with Mason's help. Mason refuses, but Claire wants to stay with Venegas, citing the opportunity a coup could present. Mason insists and grabs his luggage and a gun before heading off with Claire. We then see former Army Colonel Jan Kohorst watching his daughter practice for a dance recital. He gets a call and learns that everyone who attacked Venegas is dead and decides to get involved. Mason and Claire are trekking it through the jungle. Venegas catches up with them, and Mason tells her that men are trying to kill Venegas. Mason then uses a satellite phone to call Sebastian and tell him about the situation. Sebastian then arranges an extraction for them nearby. Venegas asks to borrow Mason's phone, but he refuses. And when Venegas threatens to have him arrested for being a spy, Mason pulls his gun on him. Claire jumps between them and Mason lowers his gun and hesitantly hands Venegas the phone. Venegas then reaches out to his nephew Jorge, who is preparing to take Venegas's place and is shocked to hear his uncle's voice. Jorge craps his pants, and after the call ends, it is revealed that he is the one behind the coup. Venegas reveals to Mason and Claire that he knows his nephew is behind the coup but acted like everything was okay, indicating that you must stroke the head you are looking to cut off. He wants to head to the capital, but Mason again refuses to help Venegas and leaves with Claire behind him. Claire is worried about Venegas and her interview, but Mason keeps moving. He gets a call back from a team who are on their way to pick them up in a chopper. The chopper soon arrives and the two are relieved, but when the chopper drops off 2 mercenaries and flies away, Mason tells Claire to run. The chopper then suddenly begins shooting at the two, tearing down trees around them. The 2 mercenaries also open fire, but Mason and Claire manage to outrun the explosions. They get to a river and begin to cross with the chopper firing missiles at them and still missing somehow. The 2 escape unharmed. The 2 get to some tall grass, and Mason mounts his sniper rifle and takes aim at the chopper heading to him. He begins firing off shots and hits the pilot, with Claire catching it all on her cell phone. The 2 mercenaries are still on their tail, and Claire and Mason end up getting split up. The mercenaries are tracking Claire, who is calling loudly for Mason. She manages to spot one of the men and hide. Grabbing a piece of wood, the mercenary is about to attack, but Mason ambushes him and the 2 struggle. Mason is getting choked out, but manages to overpower the man and strangle him to death. The other man holds them at gunpoint, but is suddenly shot by Venegas and his golden gun, which he calls Juanita. Mason then thanks him for his help. We then see Jorge and the military team at the helicopter crash site. When Colonel John and the team arrives, the 2 chastise each other for failing to kill Venegas. But John makes it clear that his clients hate failure and shoots Jorge's second dead. Mason, Claire, and Venegas stop by a river to freshen up when she asks him about his back injury. He simply tells her that he was injured on his last mission. She asks about his marriage life, but Mason thinks that he may be separated by now. Venegas leads the 2 to a village in the jungle, which turns out to be his childhood home, and introduces them to the leader of the village, Ernesto. Afterwards, Claire and Venegas sit for their interview with Mason as their cameraman. She asked him about his theory behind the coup, and Venegas admits that for years he allowed private organizations to plunder his country for resources while they funded his presidency. But he has had a change of heart. The company who wanted these resources then decided to fund the overthrow of Venegas to prop up someone they can control. Venegas then promises his people that he will defend them from the corporations, and the people celebrate him. After a party that night, Mason and Claire come back to their rooms. When Claire, clearly tipsy, but Mason, remembering that he has a miserable and disappointed wife at home, refuses her advances. The next morning, Mason wants them to leave right away and get to safety, seeing that she got her interview, but Claire wants to head to the capital to capture the coup. Venegas overhears them and comes in, asking Mason why he of all persons was chosen for the Paldonia mission, and leaves Mason to think things over. Mason contacts Sebastian, indicating that he knows it's no coincidence that he was sent to Paldonia just around the time of a coup. Sebastian finally comes clean, telling Mason that his clients wanted him to kill Venegas, and thought that Mason would see it as a gift to kill the man that killed their friends. The call ends, and Mason considers the proposal and his chance to get his revenge. He then calls home, and Casey answers. He tells her that he misses her, and Casey tells him to come home as Jenny is sad. Jenny comes to the phone, and Mason thanks her for sticking with him, and she tells him she loves him and begs him to come home in one piece. Mason then pulls his gun and walks grimly over to Venegas, ordering Claire to get moving as they are heading to the border. Suddenly, Colonel Jan and his men come speeding into the village, and Mason grabs Claire and takes off. Colonel Jan steps up, shouting for Venegas to reveal himself. Ernesto steps up to Jan, claiming that he is not here, but Jan knocks him over the head. The other villagers begin to gather, but Jan fires off shots. Venegas sees Ernesto on the ground and bravely steps out and reveals himself to Jan. Mason and Claire get themselves 2 horses, and he manages to grab Venegas as Jan fires at them. They take off riding with the men in pursuit. The men fire off shots at them, but they manage to escape. Unfortunately, Claire falls from her horse and gets grabbed by the men. Mason and Venegas see them taking Claire away, so he decides on heading to the capital to save her. On the way, Jan claims that he and his men were contracted on behalf of the people of Paldonia to overthrow Venegas, and they are here to bring stability and peace. On their way to the capital, Mason reveals to Venegas that he was hired to kill him, which Venegas already knew. He knows Mason blames him for the death of his friends and his injury, but in a twist he reveals that he was not responsible for the attack on the men. On the night of the invasion, Venegas was getting ready to escape the country when he heard about the helicopter being shot down. The next day, he was approached by a man who informed him that he should sign off on oil leases, or the next helicopter would land. Mason realizes that he was being used all along when they come upon the capital. Mason and Venegas stop at a church when he gets a call from Sebastian, telling that he cut ties with Jan and he will make this go away. But Mason tells him they need to talk. Mason and Venegas sit over a meal when he reveals that he agreed to trade Venegas for Claire. But he seems okay with this, knowing that a fight is coming. Venegas meets with the leader of the opposition resistance, who is secretly his friend, asking him for help. Venegas explains that he pays them to cause chaos, so that he can be the one to step in and bring order. Mason gets to the exchange spot, and soon Jan and his men pull up with Claire. Mason and Jan come face to face and both pull guns on each other. Claire is dragged from the car, and Mason calls for Venegas, but soon the large crowd of people come rushing up to the men, and Claire manages to free herself, and she and Mason escape in the chaos. Venegas then leads the two through a secret passage into the palace. They find Jorge taking selfies and hold a gun to him. Claire begins to live stream when Venegas uses talk no jutsu on Jorge and wins him over. The general enters, and upon seeing Venegas he shoots him, but Venegas manages to shoot him dead. They soon realize that Jorge has been shot and he dies in Venegas' arms. Suddenly, Paldonia soldiers rush into the room and surround them, but Venegas uses Sage Mode Talk no Jutsu and gets all the men on his side. Jan and his men soon arrive, but Venegas' jutsu is powerful, and the soldiers open fire on the mercenaries. There is an intense shootout, with Mason also joining in the fun. The three escape through the secret tunnel, and Mason kills 2 attackers before they escape into Jan's secret room. They try to sneak out, but Jan finds them and opens fire. Mason stays behind while Venegas and Claire escape, and he barely manages to escape a grenade explosion. He fights off his attackers until he and Jan end up in a struggle, throwing some heavy punches. Jan pulls a knife, but Mason defends himself well from the strikes before throwing Jan. Jan recovers and slashes at Mason, but his skills show and he throws them both down the stairs. Jan tries ending Mason, who holds him off. But when Jan reveals that he was the one who shot down Mason's helicopter and killed his friends, Mason manages to hold him off long enough for Claire to karate chop him in the throat. Outside, the Paldonian military are facing off against the remaining mercenaries, who are slowly advancing on them. Mason gets back to the fight and starts opening up on the men, killing a few and giving both Claire and Venegas raging boners. Just then, Sebastian and his own men turn up and change the tide of the battle, and the mercenaries are pushed out of the palace. With the revolution crushed, Claire's interview and video footage goes viral and views on Venegas begin to change. Venegas then announces that he is stepping down as Paldonia's president and allowing a freely elected government in his place. Jenny, who is watching the news, is shocked to see Mason there. The following day, Mason returns home where he is greeted warmly by Casey. Jenny hugs him in tears, and Mason tells her he is ready to give her the life she deserves. In the car, Mason gets a message from Venegas, and when he stops by an ATM machine, his account now has $5.5 million. Mason steps out excited, noting to himself that for the first time in a long while, he felt happy again.